Flight 447 was descending into chaos at 30,000 feet. The captain's desperate voice crackled over the intercom. "We need a fighter pilot now." Passengers screamed as the plane shook violently. In first class, a quiet black woman calmly unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, changing 200 lives forever. But let me tell you how we got here, because this story begins 3 hours earlier at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, where Cassandra Mitchell was about to board what should have been a routine flight to Los Angeles. Cassandra, or Cass as her friends called her, walked through the terminal with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to move through the world without drawing unnecessary attention. At 35, she carried herself with an understated elegance that spoke of discipline and strength, though most people wouldn't look twice at the simply dressed black woman making her way to gate B12. She wore dark jeans, a crisp white button-down, and comfortable flats, practical clothes for someone who valued function over flash. When she presented her boarding pass to the gate agent, the woman's eyebrows shot up slightly. First class. The agent glanced from the ticket to Cass's face, then back to the ticket, as if confirming some impossible equation. "Ma'am, are you sure this is your seat assignment?" she asked, her voice carrying that particular tone of polite skepticism that Cass had heard countless times before. "Yes, I'm sure," Cass replied evenly, her voice calm but firm. She'd learned long ago that getting defensive only made these situations worse. The gate agent studied her ID for what felt like an eternity before finally, reluctantly, allowing her to board. Walking down the jet bridge, Cass took a deep breath. She was flying to Los Angeles to visit her mother, who was battling stage 4 cancer at Cedars-Sinai. This trip wasn't a vacation or a business opportunity, it was potentially goodbye. She'd used her savings and military benefits to upgrade to first class because she wanted these few hours of peace before facing what might be her mother's final weeks. As she settled into seat 2A, Cass noticed the man in 2B giving her sideways glances. Richard Sterling was everything Central Casting would order for a wealthy businessman. Silver hair, expensive suit, gold watch that caught the light every time he gestured while talking loudly on his phone about some merger that would make him stupid rich. He ended his call and turned to study his seat companion with barely concealed disdain. "Excuse me," Richard said to the flight attendant, a blonde woman named Jennifer who appeared with practiced efficiency. "I think there might be some confusion with the seating." Jennifer looked at Cass with the same expression the gate agent had worn. "Ma'am, could you show me your boarding pass?" Cass handed it over without comment. She'd played this game before. Jennifer examined it thoroughly as if it might be counterfeit, before reluctantly confirming that, yes, Cassandra Mitchell was indeed assigned to seat 2A. "How about that?" Richard muttered under his breath, just loud enough to be heard. "Must be one of those diversity programs. Affirmative action for airline seats now." The comment hit Cass like a slap, but she'd learned in the military that sometimes the best response was no response at all. She pulled out a worn paperback, a biography of the Tuskegee Airmen, and settled in to read. If Richard noticed the irony, he didn't show it. As more passengers boarded, the whispers continued. Patricia Whitmore, a socialite in seat 1C, loud whispered to her companion, "I just don't understand how some people can afford these seats. I mean, do you know what I had to pay?" Her eyes clearly indicated who some people referred to. Cass put on her noise-canceling headphones and closed her eyes. She'd endured worse than passive-aggressive comments from entitled strangers. Boot camp, combat missions over Afghanistan, the boys' club of military aviation where she'd had to be twice as good just to be considered half as qualified. This was nothing. Still, the exhaustion of constantly having to prove her right to exist in spaces like this weighed on her more heavily these days. The flight attendants completed their safety demonstration, and Flight 447 began its taxi toward the runway. As they lifted off into the Georgia sky, Cass allowed herself to relax for the first time in months. Up here, above the clouds, the problems of the ground seemed smaller. She'd always found peace in the sky. For the first hour, everything proceeded normally. The flight attendants served drinks, Richard got his scotch with elaborate deference while Cass had to ask twice for her ginger ale. The meal service began, and Richard launched into a loud conversation with Patricia about his latest business acquisition. "The problem with this country," Richard declared, cutting into his filet mignon, "is that we've gotten too focused on giving handouts instead of rewarding merit. Some people think they deserve what they haven't earned." The turbulence started gradually, just little bumps that made the ice clink in glasses, but within minutes it intensified to something none of them had experienced before. The plane lurched violently to the left, throwing Richard's wine across Cass's tray table. "Jesus!" Richard shouted. "You bumped my arm!" Jennifer rushed over immediately. "Oh, Mr. Sterling, I'm so sorry. Let me get you another wine. And you, ma'am." She turned to Cass with accusation in her voice. "You need to be more careful with your movements during turbulence." Cass looked down at her soaked lap and ruined book, then back at Jennifer. She hadn't moved. Richard's glass had flown off his tray when the plane pitched, but somehow this was her fault. Without a word, she began cleaning up the spill with her napkin. "I'll get you upgraded to business class, Mr. Sterling," Jennifer continued, as an apology for the inconvenience. "What about her seat?" Richard pointed at Cass. "She's the one who caused this." The unfairness of it hit Cass like a physical blow, but she remained silent. She'd learned that defending herself in situations like this often made things worse. Instead, she retreated inward, the way she had during her darkest days in the service when the isolation and discrimination had nearly broken her. But the turbulence wasn't finished. If anything, it was getting worse. The captain's voice came over the intercom, and for the first time there was tension in his tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're encountering some unexpected weather. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Within minutes, the unexpected weather revealed itself to be something far more serious. The plane began pitching and rolling like a ship in a storm. Passengers screamed as luggage fell from overhead compartments. The lights flickered, then went out completely, replaced by the eerie glow of emergency lighting. Then came the sound that every passenger fears, the mechanical whine of oxygen masks dropping from the ceiling. All around the cabin, people fumbled to put them on while the plane shook so violently that some passengers couldn't stay in their seats despite their seatbelts. "This is Captain Morrison," came the voice over the intercom, but now the calm professionalism was cracking. "We are experiencing severe weather and some technical difficulties. Flight attendants, please prepare for emergency procedures." In the cockpit, Captain Morrison was facing every pilot's nightmare. The navigation systems had failed one by one, victims of a freak electromagnetic storm that hadn't appeared on any weather radar. His co-pilot, overwhelmed by the stress and the violent turbulence, had passed out and couldn't be revived. The radio was cutting in and out, making communication with ground control nearly impossible. Morrison had 30 years of flying experience, but this was beyond anything in his training manual. He was essentially flying blind through a massive storm system with a plane full of passengers and no backup. The fuel gauges showed they were burning through their reserves at an alarming rate due to the constant course corrections needed to fight the storm. The plane lurched again, this time dropping what felt like 1,000 feet in seconds. Passengers screamed and several people were sick. In first class, Patricia was sobbing while Richard had gone pale and silent, gripping his armrest so tightly his knuckles were white. That's when Captain Morrison made the decision that would change everything. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice came over the intercom, and now the desperation was unmistakable. "This is an emergency situation. I need to ask if there are any passengers on board with advanced flight training. Military pilots, please identify yourselves immediately. We need your assistance." The cabin fell into stunned silence. Richard looked around wildly. Is he seriously asking passengers to fly the plane? Other passengers began to panic. Some were crying, others praying, and a few were frantically trying to call loved ones despite the no cell phone rule. The flight attendants trained to maintain calm were visibly struggling to contain their own fear. In seat 2A, Cassandra Mitchell sat perfectly still for a long moment. Then, with the same quiet confidence she'd shown since boarding, she unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up. "Ma'am, please return to your seat immediately." Jennifer rushed toward her. Cass looked at the flight attendant with steady eyes. "I'm Colonel Cassandra Mitchell, United States Air Force. I'm a fighter pilot with 15 years of experience. I believe I can help." The words seemed to echo in the suddenly quiet cabin. Richard's mouth fell open. Patricia stopped crying and stared. Every passenger in first class turned to look at the woman they'd dismissed, judged, and ignored. Jennifer's entire demeanor changed instantly. "Oh my God, yes, please, right this way, Colonel." As Cass walked toward the cockpit, she could hear the whispers starting behind her. "She's a pilot? Military? I thought she was just—" But she didn't have time for their shock. People's lives were at stake. The cockpit was a scene of controlled chaos. Captain Morrison was fighting the controls while sweat poured down his face. The co-pilot was unconscious in his seat, and warning lights blinked across every panel like a deadly Christmas display. "Captain Morrison," Cass said, stepping into the cockpit. "I'm Colonel Mitchell, Air Force. What's your situation?" Morrison looked up at her with desperate relief. "Colonel, thank God. We've lost navigation, radio's intermittent, and I'm flying blind in this storm. Co-pilot's down and we're burning fuel fast. I've got 30 years flying commercial, but this is beyond my experience." Cass quickly scanned the instrument panel, her training taking over. She'd flown F-22 Raptors through combat situations that would terrify most pilots, and while this was a different aircraft entirely, the principles of crisis flight management were the same. "How much fuel do we have?" she asked, settling into the co-pilot seat. "Maybe 40 minutes at this burn rate," Morrison replied. Cass looked at the weather radar, what little was working, and made rapid calculations. "I'm going to try something I learned flying combat missions in Afghanistan. We're going to use this storm instead of fighting it." What Cass did next was nothing short of brilliant. Instead of trying to fly around the storm, she found the eye of it and rode the air currents, using techniques she'd learned dodging surface-to-air missiles in hostile territory. She manually navigated using ground landmarks and star positions, skills that had kept her alive during night missions when GPS was compromised. The passengers felt the plane stabilize under her expert control. The violent shaking subsided to manageable turbulence, and for the first time in an hour, people began to believe they might actually survive this flight, but they weren't safe yet. The fuel situation was critical, and they needed to land immediately. The nearest major airport was socked in by the storm, but Cass spotted something on the horizon, a small regional airport that could handle their aircraft if she could execute a perfect approach. "Captain, I need you to declare an emergency and get clearance for Henderson Regional Airport," she instructed. "I'm going to bring us in on fumes, but I can do it." Morrison had never been so grateful to follow someone else's orders in his life. The landing was textbook perfect, despite the crosswinds and the fact that they were running on vapors. Emergency vehicles surrounded the small airport as Flight 447 touched down safely, carrying 200 passengers who owed their lives to the woman most of them had barely noticed when they boarded. As the plane taxied to a stop, the cabin erupted in applause and tears of relief. But Cass remained focused, helping the crew with post-landing procedures and ensuring all passengers could evacuate safely. It wasn't until she finally emerged from the cockpit that the real reckoning began. Richard Sterling was the first to approach her, his face a mixture of shame and gratitude. "Colonel Mitchell, I owe you my life, and I owe you an apology that I don't know how to make." Patricia Whitmore was openly weeping. "I am so sorry for how I treated you. You saved us all, and I was so horrible to you." One by one, passengers approached Cass to thank her personally. The flight attendants, who had initially questioned her presence in first class, now looked at her with a mixture of awe and embarrassment. But the biggest surprise was yet to come. As news crews arrived at the small airport, a reporter recognized Cass from previous military commendations. "Colonel Mitchell, our research shows you're not just any pilot. You're one of the first black women to be certified on the F-22 Raptor, aren't you?" The revelation sent shockwaves through the gathered crowd. Cass was a decorated war hero with multiple commendations for valor, including the Distinguished Flying Cross. She'd flown over 60 combat missions and had been instrumental in training the next generation of fighter pilots. She was currently on medical leave, dealing with PTSD after losing several squadron members in her last deployment. The story went viral within hours. Hero pilot saves 200 lives became trending news worldwide. The video of her calm exit from the cockpit, contrasted with earlier footage of passengers dismissing her, became a powerful symbol of hidden strength and the danger of prejudice. The life-changing offers began pouring in immediately. Delta Airlines offered her a position as chief pilot, making her one of the highest-ranking black women in commercial aviation. Richard Sterling's investment firm established a $10 million scholarship fund for women of color pursuing careers in aviation, with Cass as its first board chair. But the most important moment came when Cass finally arrived at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles, 18 hours late but alive. Her mother, weak from chemotherapy but with eyes bright with pride, took her daughter's hand. "I always knew you were destined to lift others up, baby girl," she whispered. "Your whole life, that's what you've done. Lifted others up." 6 months later, Colonel Cassandra Mitchell stood before her first class of diverse female military pilots at the Air Force Academy. The Mitchell Foundation for Aviation Diversity had already provided scholarships to over 100 young women of color, and her story had inspired thousands more to pursue careers they'd never thought possible. But it was her closing message to her students that captured the real lesson of Flight 447. "That day taught me something I thought I already knew but had to learn again. Respect isn't about the clothes you wear, the color of your skin, or how much money you have in your bank account. It's about character, and character is something you can't see from the outside. Every person you meet is fighting battles you know nothing about, carrying skills and strength you can't imagine, and deserving of dignity that you should give freely, not begrudgingly." She paused, looking at the eager faces of her students, young women of every background who would go on to break barriers she had only begun to crack. "Don't judge a book by its cover," she continued, "because you never know when that person sitting quietly beside you might be the one to save your life. More importantly, you never know when you might be that person for someone else." Today, Colonel Cassandra Mitchell continues to serve her country while running the foundation that bears her name. She has trained over 300 pilots and has become one of the most respected voices in military aviation. But perhaps more importantly, she has never forgotten the lesson of Flight 447, that heroism often comes from the most unexpected places, and that the quiet dignity of those we overlook might just be the strength that saves us all. The passengers of Flight 447 certainly never forgot. Many of them have gone on to become advocates for diversity and inclusion in their own fields, using their second chance at life to ensure that others don't have to prove their worth in moments of crisis. Because sometimes it takes 30,000 feet in mortal danger to teach us what should have been obvious all along, that extraordinary people come in every color, from every background, and the only way to recognize them is to treat everyone with the respect they deserve. After all, you never know when the person you're ignoring might be the one who saves your life.